All right, so this is our lecture on spiritual gifts. We're going to do an exegesis of 1 Corinthians chapter 12. First thing we're going to do is we're going to read 1 Corinthians chapter 12. And if you want to follow along, I'm going to be reading from the ESV. Paul writes, "Now concerning spiritual gifts, brothers, I do not want you to be uninformed. You know that when you were pagans, you were led astray to mute idols, however you were led. Therefore, I want you to understand that no one speaking in the Spirit of God ever says Jesus is accursed. And no one can say Jesus is Lord except in the Holy Spirit. Now, there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. And there are varieties of service, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who empowers them all in every one. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. For to one is given through the Spirit the utterance of wisdom, and to another the utterance of knowledge, according to the same Spirit. To another, faith by the same Spirit. To another, gifts of healing by the one Spirit. To another, the working of miracles. To another, prophecy. To another, the ability to distinguish between spirits. To another, various kinds of tongues. To another, the interpretation of tongues. All these are empowered by one and the same Spirit, who apportions to each one individually as he wills." Verse 12. "For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many are one body, so it is with Christ. For in one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, and all were made to drink of one Spirit. For the body does not consist of one member, but of many. If the foot should say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye," I'm sorry, I just had a picture of the Monsters, Inc. little character that had the big eye. I'm sorry. All right. If the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? Or where would be the sense of hearing? If the whole body were an ear, where would be the sense of smell? But as it is, God arranged the members in the body, each one of them as he chose. If all were a single member, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, yet one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, the parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. And on those parts of the body that we think less honorable, we bestow the greater honor, and our unpresentable parts are treated with greater modesty, which our more presentable parts do not require. But God has so composed the body, giving greater honor to the part that lacked it, that there may be no division in the body, but that the members may have the same care for one another. If one member suffers, all suffer together. If one member is honored, all rejoice together. Now you are the body of Christ, and individually members of it. And God has appointed in the church first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then miracles, then gifts of healing, helping, administrating, and various kinds of tongues. Are all apostles? Are all prophets? Are all teachers? Do all work miracles? Do all possess gifts of healing? Do all speak with tongues? Do all interpret? But I earnestly desire the higher gifts, and I will show you a more excellent way. All right, so that's 1 Corinthians chapter 12. So you have an exegesis that you have to do. So what I want you to do is pay attention to the elements that I highlight in my exegesis so you can think through, okay, these are some elements that I need to include in mine, right? So here are the elements I'm going to review in this exegesis. We're going to look at author, date, and audience. You always kind of start there. We're going to look at the occasion and a general outline. We'll do a grammatical analysis. We're going to look at some of the grammar, and then I'm going to offer commentary. All right, so those are Those are the four sort of elements of the lecture tonight. All right, author, date, and audience. All right, so we know Paul authored this letter, right? Reason we know Paul authored this letter because 1 Corinthians starts with I, Paul, called by the will of God, right? Paul, called by the will of God. So Paul announces himself as the author. So it begins with the same announcement that he makes at the beginning of nearly every letter to which he is accredited as the author, right? So that's the author. The audience, we know the audience is the Christian community located at Corinth. Corinth's located 50 or so miles west of Athens in Greece. It was a major port city, major center of commerce and culture. You can go there today. It's an archaeology site. It's a historical site. You can go to the place where Paul preached. You can read in Acts where he went on top of Mars Hill and preached. You can stand on top of Mars Hill. I have a picture of my wife standing on top of Mars Hill in Corinth. So, but in the first century, it was a major city center of commerce until it was destroyed by the Romans. The Romans destroyed it in 146 or so. Then was rebuilt in 44. So it was destroyed in 146 BCE, rebuilt in 44 BCE, and Roman colonies were planted there sort of as a strategic effort to kind of bring some economy to the region and also an outpost for the military. By the time Paul came in 50 to 52 CE, there were approximately 500,000 people, and it had become the capital of that province. Achaia was a province. So most scholars believe that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians around 55 CE. And here's how we know that. You read Acts 18. Acts 18 tells us that Paul was in Corinth when Gallio was the proconsul of Achaia, the province of Achaia. We know from history that Gallio was the brother of the Roman philosopher Seneca. If you heard of Seneca in philosophy, if you ever watched the Hunger Games, one of the characters was named Seneca after that Roman philosopher. So we know when Gallio was the proconsul of Achaia. It was kind of a short window of time in the early 50s. And so Acts 18:11 tells us that Paul remained in Corinth for about 18 months. So given the dates when Gallio was the proconsul of Achaia, given the fact that Paul was there for roughly 18 months or so, we can pretty well pinpoint that Paul wrote the letter of 1 Corinthians around 55 CE. So author's Paul, audience is the church at Corinth, and the date is roughly 55 CE. All right, let's look at a general outline of the book. So 1 Corinthians is a very interesting book because it's written to a problem congregation, right? Corinth had a lot of problems, had a lot of division in the church, but it wasn't, so when we think about church, right? If you think about the church you go to, and if I were to write a letter to your church, the idea we have of church is that your congregation would get the letter. But in the first century, the church at Corinth was sort of a confederation of house churches. And so if Paul is writing a letter to the Christians or to the church in Corinth, then he is writing a letter to all of the Christians who meet in various house churches. So this letter, this is why we have so many copies of the New Testament. So this letter would have been copied a bunch of times so that each church or each house church could have a copy of it, right? So the letter would come to whomever, they would read it and they would pass it around. But can you imagine gathering on a Sunday and somebody knocks on the church door, you go open it and say, "Hey guys, I got a letter from Paul." And the pastor says, "Well, let's read it." And they read the letter from Paul. That was about how that took place. So the general outline of the book kind of follows these problems. So Paul's information about the problems in the Corinth church comes from two different sources. 1 Corinthians 1:11 identifies, quote, Chloe's people as a source of information. So most commentators take that to mean those from Chloe's household. So Chloe's people in 1:11, probably people from Chloe's household. In fact, the New International Version actually translates it Chloe's household. So Chloe's people, that was one source of information for Paul. And 7:1, 1 Corinthians 7:1 identifies a second source, which is a letter from a person or persons in Corinth that wrote to Paul describing some of the problems that they were having. And so you've got two sources of information. And so you can generally divide the book of 1 Corinthians based on the problems that are being addressed by those two different sources. So chapters 1 through 6 are going to deal with the information that Paul got from Chloe's people or Chloe's household. And then chapters 7 through 16 is dealing more with the problems that were addressed in the anonymous letter that he got, right? Any questions so far? No, I'm moving pretty quickly, but I want to get to a grammatical analysis of 12:1 because I'm trying to be conscious of our time. So here's an outline. If you're interested, you don't have to write this down, but if you were looking at an outline, this might be one of the ways you could outline it. The introduction would be chapter 1, verses 1 through 9. That's just introductory remarks from Paul. He addresses disunity and community fragmentation. By the way, this outline, I got this from a commentary written by Richard Oster. So this is not my outline. This is from a commentary by Richard Oster. Oster says that the second section is disunity and community fragmentation. That would be from chapter 1, verse 10 through chapter 4, verse 20. By the way, it's hard for me to remember everything that's going to be on a final exam, midterm or final exam. If you get a question about 1 Corinthians 12:1 on the final, you do not have to put this outline in there. This is just kind of for your information. Like if you were looking at studying the book of 1 Corinthians and really kind of breaking it up, this would be a good outline to break it up. So this is just kind of for your information. The third section would be reports of immorality. This is 5:1 through 6:20. Paul addresses sexuality, celibacy, and marriage in chapter 7, 1 through 40. He addresses idolatry in 8:1 through 11:1. He addresses liturgical aberrations. This would be problems in the worship, or where he talks about the way that they're doing things wrong in the worship service. That would be chapter 11, verses 2 through 34. Misunderstanding of spiritual gifts, which is kind of our topic, right? Because this course covers spiritual gifts. 12:1 through 14:40. Now, we're not going to do through 14:40. We're just going to do chapter 12. He addresses misunderstanding of the resurrection, believer's resurrection, in chapter 15, 1 through 58. And then he talks about instructions for the collection or taking up an offering in chapter 16, 1 through 11. Then he concludes it in chapter 16, 12 through 24. So 10 sections. And what you're going to find, guys, is as many commentaries that possibly could have been written over the last 2,000 years regarding 1 Corinthians. Whatever that number is, there's an equal number of ways people divide the book up, right? So it just depends on how you read it and how you see it. I think you're going to find most commentaries are going to be kind of in this same vein, right? That because these are the major issues. But if you wanted to, let's say that you wanted to teach through 1 Corinthians, something like this, an outline like this would really help you to break it up. Like if if you said, hey, I want to do an 8-week study of 1 Corinthians, well, you could do the introduction and the first section in 1 week, and you could do the last section and the conclusion in the last week, right? So you've got 10 weeks. So that's the sort of things you want to think about when you start teaching formally or teaching in your church. You want to think about breaking these books up into sections so they're easier to do. All right, any questions so far? We good? All right. So let's look at some grammatical analysis of chapter 12. And this is really getting into the meat of what this lesson is about. So 12:1, and this is really important. So I really want you to pay attention to this, because these are the sort of things that really help us to understand, what Paul is trying to say. If you're wondering why when you're in school for theology, you have to take Greek and then sometimes Hebrew, this is why. So let's look at 12:1. In the ESV, it says, now concerning spiritual gifts, right? Here's the funny thing. In 12:1, Paul does not say gifts. He uses the term pneumatikos. And if you want an English spelling of that, it would be pneumatikos, pneumatikos, which is translated spiritual things or things pertaining to the Spirit. So he doesn't use the word gifts in 12:1. The reason we translate it spiritual gifts in 12:1 is because of what he says in 12:4. What does he say in 12:4? Now, there are a variety of gifts, but the same Spirit. The term he uses for gifts in 12:4 is the term charismata. Like if you were a charismatic, instead of putting the IC on the end, you put an A, which means gift of grace or spiritual gift, a gift of grace. So in 12:4, he is referring to 12:1. So he calls it spiritual things in 12:1, but then he defines what he means by spiritual things in 12:4, which are gifts of grace. And so 12:1 says spiritual things, 12:4 says spiritual gifts. It's a term the translators change. So what you find here is this is a really good example of what goes on when the translators are translating the Bible. When you're translating from one language to the other, it's never a word for word equivalency, right? If you know any other language, if you know Spanish really well, then you know that Spanish and English are not a perfect one-for-one translation, right? And so what the Bible translators try to do is, in every case that they can, they want to translate just the words. But the translators also have another role, which is to make it readable and understandable. So this is one of those cases where the translators chose in verse 1 to say, now concerning spiritual gifts, because they're trying to help you understand that that's really what Paul is talking about. Now, I'm on the outside just a little bit. I don't want them to do that. I want them to translate it spiritual themes, because that's what Paul said, right? That's what he said. If Paul wanted to say spiritual gifts, he would have said spiritual gifts, but he didn't. He said spiritual themes, and he explained it. So it's not wrong what the translators did, but I tend to be a little more of a literalist. But there's some other uses of gifts. So when speaking of spiritual things and gifts in 1 Corinthians, most of the time, Paul is using charismata. In 12:9, 12:28, 12:30, 12:31, he says charismata. So that's 12:9, 12:28, 12:30, 12:31. He's using gifts of grace. At the same time, in 2:13, 2:15, 3:1, 9:11, 10:3, 10:4, 14:1, 14:37, 15:44, and 15:46, he uses pneumatikos. So throughout 1 Corinthians, what you're getting is you're getting Paul interchanging spiritual things and spiritual gifts. But what we've done is we've lined up essentially behind the term spiritual gifts to make it easier for people to understand. Does that make sense? Look, the oldest existing copy of 1 Corinthians says spiritual things. I would translate it spiritual things. So that's just my 2 cents. Any questions about that? You're never going to get that time back, by the way. I just explained all that, and you're like, thanks. Was that kid? Remember that video a couple of years ago? They gave that kid an avocado for Christmas. He's like, thanks, an avocado. I don't know if you remember that video or not. All right. So let's talk about spiritual gifts in 1 Corinthians. So Paul discusses spiritual gifts in 3 places in the New Testament: Romans 12, Ephesians 4, and then 1 Corinthians 12 through 14. And in those 3 places, Romans 12, Ephesians 4, 1 Corinthians 12 through 14, generally speaking, the way that he addresses these topics is by focusing on 3 different things. He focuses on the unity of the Spirit. He focuses on the diversity of the gifts. And he focuses on proper use of the gifts. So in Romans 12, Ephesians 4, and 1 Corinthians 12, 14, he's talking about spiritual gifts. In all 3 of those passages, generally speaking, he's addressing the unity of the Spirit, the diversity of the gifts, and the proper use of the gifts. All right. So what then can we learn about spiritual gifts from 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 1 through 11? So 12, 4 through 6. Let's look there first. Now, there are a variety of gifts, but the same Spirit. And there are varieties of service, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who empowers them all in every one. So when you read that, I want you to immediately think back to Exodus chapter 31, where God says in Exodus 31:3, I have called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, and I have filled them with the Spirit of God, with ability and intelligence, with knowledge and all craftsmanship, to devise artistic designs, to work in gold, silver, bronze, in cutting stones, for setting, and in carving wood, to work every craft. What God did in Exodus 31 to empower, he gave spiritual gifts to the Israelites to design the tabernacle. They had been slaves. They didn't know these things. They did not possess, unless they did these things as a slave, they really didn't possess this knowledge. But God's very specific with Moses. I'm going to endow them with I'm going to fill them with the Spirit of God. These were spiritual gifts in the exact same way the spiritual gifts in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 are spiritual gifts. So when you think of spiritual gifts, that's what I want you to think of. Gifts given by God through the power of the Holy Spirit to empower God's people for specific tasks related to building his kingdom. That's the theological framework that I want you to put spiritual gifts in. Now, unfortunately, what happens is if you want to teach on spiritual gifts, people want you to just start talking about prophecy and tongues and all these other things. That ain't where you start with spiritual gifts, right? You start Exodus 31:3. Okay, these are spiritual gifts. First instance of spiritual gifts, and they're for a specific purpose. So God enables his people by his Spirit for his purposes. We'll say that again, because I would love to see that in an essay if you're called upon to give it. God enables his Spirit, God enables his people by his Spirit for his purposes. If you live to be 99 years old and you teach on spiritual gifts, I want you to say that to the people you're teaching. God enables his people by his Spirit for his purposes, for his purposes. Look at me. Everybody look at the camera. Even Josh.
Trying to get my camera to work.
Okay.
Yeah.
The gifts of the Spirit are for God's purposes, right? Okay, moving on. All right, 12:7. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. Spiritual gifts are for which kind of good? The common good. Spiritual gifts are not meant to exalt the bearer of the gifts. They are designed for the community. So what we see sometimes is we see people, especially if you're in a Pentecostal or charismatic tradition, you see people exercise spiritual gifts early in their ministry. And then they fall away because of the celebrity status that we place on them because of the gifts God gave them. So God gives someone a gift to build his kingdom, and we turn those people into celebrities. And then those people start wearing double-breasted suits and flying on jets, and then they fall away because they run off with their secretary or there's still a bunch of money, and then they blame us, which we are partly to blame for it because we gave them celebrity status because they were merely just a vessel for God to build his kingdom through, but we exalted them in a way that was ungodly. Not that they don't have fault, but I'm saying we're all involved in that fall, right? We're all involved in it. So never exalt the person. We exalt the Spirit. And listen, here's what happens. And this is unfortunate. This is what happens. We create spiritual hierarchies, right? If someone has a gift of prophecy, or if someone has a gift of tongues, or if someone has a gift of healing, right? Versus someone that has gifts of acts of service, right? What we do is we create a hierarchy where we say, if this person has been given the gift of healing, maybe we don't say this out loud, but the way we act says, if this person has been given the gift of healing, then they must be more spiritual than the woman that brings cupcakes to feed the people who are doing the setup every Sunday morning, right? But Paul goes through this really detailed description of the various members of the body. And he says there are members that maybe they don't seem like they're important, but they're really the most important, right? And so that's the caution we have to exercise when it comes to spiritual gifts. That makes sense? All right. So verses 8 through 10, Paul identifies some of these individual gifts. Now, before we start talking about the gifts, you need to understand that the list that Paul gives here is not a comprehensive list. Paul's not listing every imaginable gift. They're examples of gifts. And I think it is reasonable to think that God would provide sufficient gifts for any cultural context to build up his church. There's very little evidence. In fact, there's no evidence that the church in Corinth needed someone who was really good with networking and computers right? Probably. I'm just probably, right? I went to public school, so I could be wrong, but probably, right? But that is certainly something that is helpful in our cultural context. So why would we not think that God would gift someone, right? Just because you went to technical school to learn it doesn't mean God didn't gift you with it, right? So this is not an exhaustive list. I think the list changes somewhat based on cultural context, whatever God's need. If God has a need for it, right? If God has a need for a gift to build his kingdom, we can expect him to endow someone with that gift. All right, so let's go through the different gifts. First is a message of wisdom. This is the gift of communicating wisdom. It typically manifests itself in preaching or in interpersonal communication. This could also apply to the wisdom of the gospel or God's system of revealed truth, right? Wisdom. Message of knowledge. This is similar to wisdom, but knowledge is more about understanding, while wisdom might be related more to intuition. Our pastor says that wisdom is, I'm probably going to get this wrong, wisdom is learning to live in this world God's way, something like that. Like you have knowledge and wisdom, and really the way I've always thought it is knowledge is the application of wisdom, but wisdom is more like insight. So Paul, it's interesting. In this book, in really chapter 8, Paul has previously discussed knowledge in the negative. In 8:1, he juxtaposes knowledge against love. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Right? In chapter 8. But here he uses it in the positive as a spiritual gift. And so both wisdom and knowledge in these instances seems to refer to a revelation of wisdom and knowledge as opposed to just a wise or a knowledgeable person. Does that make sense? You can be wise, you can be knowledgeable. But the spiritual gift of wisdom and knowledge would be something that someone is given specifically for a task. Does that make sense? In an instance where they needed wisdom and they needed knowledge. All right. Here's something interesting. So verse 9, Paul starts this. He's done it, but he starts it really in, so verse 7, to each is given. And then he starts verse 8, for to one is given. And then in verse 9, to another. So when you see him through this discourse, he says to another, to another, to another. He says it over and over. It indicates that a new group is being introduced, meaning a different group. So what this does is this eliminates any idea of a spiritual elite that possessed all the gifts. So I'm going to read through that again, and I want you to focus in on where he says another, and I want you to understand that what he means is another group, right? Because it's in the plural. So let's read it. Start with we'll do verse 8. For to one is given through the Spirit the utterance of wisdom, and to another the utterance of knowledge according to the same Spirit, to another faith by the same Spirit, to another gifts of healing by the one Spirit, to another the working of miracles, to another prophecy, to another the ability to distinguish between spirits, and go on and on. So you have all these gifts and no one owns them all, right? They're distributed according to God's need through the congregation. Now, through this, Paul talks about faith, right? The gift of faith. And Paul speaks of faith, particularly 3 ways in his letters. He talks of saving faith. He talks of faith in terms of Abraham's faith. And he talks about supernatural faith. That's what he's talking about in 12:9. He's talking about to another faith by the same Spirit. He's talking about a supernatural type of faith, an unusual type of faith that would be required to perform various types of miracles. Perhaps the miracles that follow this faith, right? To another faith. And now, so after faith, he jumps into these miraculous gifts, right? You got wisdom, you got knowledge, right? Then you talk about faith. And then after faith, you get these, what we call miraculous gifts, gifts of healing, right? It's aligned with this supernatural faith. It means that certain people are gifted through the Spirit with the ability to heal the sick. That's what that means. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone, right? Miraculous powers. This is kind of ambiguous, so it's difficult to know exactly what Paul means here. We just really don't know exactly what he means by miraculous powers, unless he's referring, in some way as an umbrella term for other miraculous deeds similar to divine healing, right? Then he goes into prophecy, to another prophecy. So most of us, when we think about prophecy, we think about foretelling the future. That's typically how we think about prophecy. I think that is a very, very, very limited definition of prophecy. When we talk about prophecy, we go to Daniel and Ezekiel, right? We go to the Old Testament where they're looking forward. And then we go to Revelation where it's looking forward from a different point, right? Or we look at the life of Jesus and we identify all the Old Testament prophecies, the things that were said in the past about him and him being the fulfillment of those prophecies. So what I want you to do is I want you to begin to think about prophecy differently, right? So prophecy was a typical first century gift. It was in full operation in the church, and it was associated mostly with preaching through inspiration. So prophecy refers to a revelation given by God that is communicated verbally to the people. A prophet, the most simple definition I can give you of prophet. A prophet is someone who speaks for God. A prophecy is a message from God delivered by a prophet to God's people. It's a spiritual gift, and we've already said that spiritual gifts are given by God to God's people for God's purposes, right? So now, if I'm right, and I think I am, if I'm right, that prophecy is more than just foretelling the future. If the greatest expression of prophecy in the church is hearing from God and then verbally telling what you hear to the people, that's what every pastor of every church in the history of Christianity has been responsible for doing, is hearing from God and then telling what the preacher hears to the people, right? So preaching would be the most abundantly evident example that we have of the spiritual gift of prophecy. When Jesus ascended, right before he left, he said a couple of things. Go tell everybody and baptize them, right? Great Commission. And then go wait in Jerusalem for something. So they go wait in Jerusalem. And that something happens on the day of Pentecost. There's there's fire, tongues of fire. People start speaking in languages they don't understand, but the people down below do. People down on the street, they're like, these people are drunk. Peter stands up and delivers the first sermon of the Christian church and says, nope, not drunk. It's only 9 a.m. Then he quotes a prophecy from Joel, right? Everybody with me? You guys familiar with this, right? And the prophecy from Joel, Peter says, this, meaning what you see, this is that the prophet Joel declared. And what did the prophet Joel declare? And in the last days it shall be, God declares, that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. And your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Who will prophesy?
Sons and
The
daughters.
men over 40 that have a really good job and that understand what it means to get out here in the world and raise a family, and right, like that's who prophesies. Preferably a wealthy banker that loves Jesus and is really, really generous with his money. Okay? Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. The men and the women will prophesy. What is the most readily evident example of prophecy that we have in the Christian church? It's hearing from God and then saying that to God's people. We call it preaching. So when you get into a debate about what Paul may have meant or didn't mean to Timothy, that has to be part of the conversation. Can women preach? Right? That's the question. Is it biblical? If it's biblical, great. If not, great. Right? Let's just follow the Bible. Right? If you're going to have a discussion about whether women should be allowed to preach, and that's a discussion some people are having in some churches, and Southern Baptists are really having a hard time with it right now. They're really having a hard time with it. I mean, they're basically Rick Warren can't be a Baptist anymore because he says women can preach, right? So really, it's an open wound with them. I'm not saying that I've got all the answers. What I am saying is that if you're going to have a discussion about whether women biblically are allowed to preach, you really got to consider this aspect of it, because the Bible has more to say than just what Paul said to Timothy. And I'll leave it at that. All right, so that was prophecy. To distinguish between the spirits, that's the next gift. God gifts his people to understand the Holy Spirit and the things of God from the counterfeit works of Satan. Distinguish between the spirits, distinguishing between those things of God and those counterfeit works of Satan. There are certain people that have a unique gift who are hyper able to distinguish the works of the devil from the works of God. We are all supposed to have a level of discernment, but according to Paul, there is a special giftedness for this that seems like makes that person sort of hypersensitive to that sort of thing. Then he gets to tongues, to speak in different kinds of tongues and interpret tongues. Again, he's saying to another, right? To another, the gift of tongues, which indicates that that's a gift for a different group. We could take this to mean that not all persons in the congregation had these gifts. Not everybody healed. Not everybody had miraculous powers. Not everybody prophesied. Not everyone distinguishes between the spirits. Not everyone speaks in tongues, according to what Paul is saying here. And he sums up this section by restating all the gifts again and says, though these are different, they're the work of the same Spirit, and it's the Spirit that determines to whom and for which purposes these gifts are given. All right, so what do we learn? Number one, there are a variety of gifts, and we can assume that this list in chapter 12 is not exhaustive. Number two, we learned that the Holy Spirit administers the gifts according to his purpose. Number three, the gifts are for the community, not the individual. Number four, the gifts are spread out among the congregation and not only given to an elite group. I'll say this four again if you're taking notes. What did we learn? Number one, there are a variety of gifts, and we can assume this list is not exhaustive. Number two, the Holy Spirit administers the gifts according to his purpose. Number three, the gifts are for the community, not the individual. Really, you can think of someone that has a spiritual gift as a steward of that gift, right? It's not that person's. That person's responsible for sharing that gift. It's not for show and tell or for anything related to lifting up the individual. So it's for the community. Number fourth thing we learned is that the gifts are spread out among the congregation and not only given to an elite group. All right, I'm gonna stop the recording.